Before Kaldheim and Zendikar, before Alara and Ravnica, before every other plane, there was Dominaria. Over the years, this nexus of the multiverse played host to the Brothers' War, the Ice Age, and the Weatherlight Saga. When the time came in 2018 to return to Dominaria, the designers wanted a way to pay tribute to these stories of old. In so doing, they stumbled upon one of the most fun, engaging, and flavorful new mechanics in years. But there's a lot more to Sagas than you may realize, so today we'll be examining their past, their present, and possible future. Join me, won't you, for a story of Sagas. Chapter 1. In the Beginning. The origins of Saga cards actually go beyond Dominaria, way back to 2007's Lorwyn. That was the first set to include Planeswalkers, although the original plan was to put them in the previous set, Future Sight. As the first major new card type to be introduced to the game, Planeswalkers went through a lot of changes in their design. One of those early versions worked a lot like Sagas, with 3 abilities that triggered over consecutive turns. The big difference was that these early Planeswalkers could still be attacked. Plus, when they used their final ability, they weren't sacrificed. Instead, they would cycle back to their first ability on the next turn. In the end, Wizards did not go with this design, thinking that it made the Planeswalker characters feel too robotic. So we got the current design for Planeswalkers instead, which, well, we'll come back to that. The old Planeswalker design remained in a drawer somewhere for 11 years, until it became time to create the mechanics of Dominaria. Now, it's no secret that I've never been shy about criticizing Wizards of the Coast for any number of questionable decisions over the years, but let me now praise them for their transparency in the design process. The only reason we know everything I'm about to tell you is because of a series of exhaustively detailed articles from Mark Rosewater himself, as well as many other designers at Wizards of the Coast. It's easy to take this for granted, especially when you've been playing Magic the Gathering for a long time, but we shouldn't lose sight of how valuable a resource these decades of articles truly are. For example, Konami does not do this with Yu-Gi-Oh! Creatures Incorporated does not do this with Pokemon. Nobody beats Wizards of the Coast for sheer transparency, at least when it comes to design. As I mentioned, the goal for Dominaria was to create a mechanic that told a story. One of the themes of this set was history, which is also how we got the historic mechanic. But Sagas had to do something else. They had to specifically retell an event from the past through the mechanics of the game. The original prototypes came from Richard Garfield, who was on the design team for the set, his first in 7 years. They looked like this. The idea was that you would place a counter on the track and advance it whenever you were allowed, using the key at the bottom to determine which effects happened when. Looking at these, you can see the seed of the idea that Sagas would become. But some important things changed over the course of development. First, they were changed from their own permanent type to enchantments. Secondly, they removed the requirements to advance the story, which they found slowed things down. Lastly, instead of a physical track on the card, they created a sequence of abilities that triggered with additional counters. Still, the spirit of Garfield's original creation remained intact, and Sagas were unleashed upon the world. The Eldest Reborn depicted the rise of Nicol Bolas, while Time of Ice condensed the whole of the Ice Age block into a single card. Old names like Freyalise and Gerard were given new life, while new stories like the reign of Belzenlok were similarly immortalized. One of the things that made the Sagas of Dominaria so great was that despite their innovative gameplay, they were incredibly intuitive. The chapter structure makes it easy to tell at a glance what happens each turn, and the regularity of knowing that it will always trigger every turn makes the variety of effects on offer much more comprehensible. Sagas were a hit as soon as they were announced, and even though they'd only been designed with Dominaria in mind, it soon became obvious that they would be back in no time. As it turned out, we didn't have to wait long. Chapter 2. The Glorious Return. As you may know, Magic the Gathering sets are designed about 2 years ahead. While Dominaria was being released, the design team were already working on a set they had codenamed Baseball. It was during that time that Mark Rosewater answered a question on Tumblr. How feasible would it be to add Sagas to a set that was already in development? Mark said that it would be possible for archery, which turned out to be Throne of Eldraine, and probable for baseball, if they wanted to do it at all. As it turned out, baseball was Theros Beyond Death, and Sagas did indeed return. In fact, there was a running joke in R&D that every set between Dominaria and Theros tried to add Sagas because they all wanted to use the new designs. Clearly, the designers loved the idea of Sagas just as much as players eventually would. But it was Theros that got them in the end, with new cards depicting myths with Greek inspirations, as well as crucial story moments like Elspeth Conquers Death. This turned out to be more important than anyone could have realized, given that the rest of the set's story didn't exactly happen. This leads me to the other great thing about Sagas, particularly when used on worlds other than Dominaria. For a few years now, the creative team have been selecting story spotlight cards to highlight the more important aspects of the story. Some of these work very well, like Broken Bond. Others have less impact, like Triumphant Surge, simply because we aren't shown why this matters. Sagas offer a neat alternative to this method of storytelling. They allow a single card to show multiple stages of progression, thereby telling a story all on their own. What's more, this story plays out across the battlefield, intrinsically entwined with the game's state, which brings us to Kaldheim. Just 1 year after the return of Sagas in Theros, they made their third appearance in Kaldheim. This set contained considerably more Sagas than either previous set, with 10 rare and 10 uncommon Sagas. That's 2 for each color pair, to represent the 10 realms. As well as providing us with the first multicolored Sagas, this set was the first time Sagas had been used in a brand new plane, rather than a set returning to an old one. This is more important than you might think, because in Dominaria, Sagas were designed to retell stories that players were already familiar with. And even if you're a newly sparked planeswalker who doesn't yet know their weak stone from their might stone, it was clear that cards like the Antiquities War held some greater significance to Magic's past. With Kaldheim, there was no such guarantee. These stories were all brand new. They still work very well, of course. Taking their cue from Norse myth, the Kaldheim Sagas used their multicolored gimmick to the fullest extent, incorporating other set mechanics like Changeling and Foretell. The Trickster God's heist depicted Tybalt's entry into the story, as well as him, obtaining the Tyrite sword. Alongside the return of online Magic stories, Sagas are tying together the two halves of the game, the mechanics and the story, like never before. But you know what? That isn't even the best part, because we haven't yet talked about the art. Chapter 3, 1,000 Words. Sagas have a special text box, which allows them to fit all those words onto the card. But it also gave the creative team an idea to make the art for Sagas something special. Back in Dominaria, one of the ideas for reflecting the plane's history was to depict in-world pieces of art, things that the Dominarians had created to tell their own story. For that reason, History of Benalia is presented as a stained glass piece, as though the churches of Benalia had created it themselves. Similarly, the first eruption is a detailed tapestry created by the Gitu. Artist Steve Belladin was given a brief that mentioned that the Gitu people are nomadic, so they roll up their art and take it with them. That kind of world building persisted throughout Theros, with cards representing mosaics, statues, and shield engravings. But this practice reached its peak in Kaldheim. There we got wood carvings that were actually carved by the artists. One of the most incredible pieces of magic art I've ever seen, this tattoo for the Blood Sky Massacre is similarly impressive. Though as far as I'm aware, it's not an actual tattoo. Perhaps my favorite is Arnie Slays the Troll, a card that depicts Arnie Brokenbrow slaying a troll. What isn't immediately obvious from looking at the art is that these carvings have been made in a troll's tusk. More than anything else, sagas are an opportunity for the artists of Magic the Gathering to really let loose and try something new, which I am all for. So, now that we've covered the past and we've examined the present, what does the future of sagas look like? Chapter 4, Looking Forward. There's almost no question that sagas will be back. The only question is when. I don't see them immediately returning for Strixhaven, but perhaps the Dungeons & Dragons crossover set later this year will be a good fit. After all, Dungeons & Dragons is all about stories. There is a bigger issue to consider, however. Sagas have proven so popular and versatile that there's a chance we could see them much more frequently, as what's called a deciduous mechanic. That's a mechanic that isn't in every set like flying, but can still be used if a designer wants to without worrying about filling the set with complexity. Another example is vehicles, which show up in small quantities every now and then. Mark Rosewater has said that sagas could become deciduous in the future, and given that R&D worked 2 years ahead, perhaps they already have. That means we could get sets with just 1 or 2 sagas, highlighting the key elements of a story. Perhaps they could even replace the story spotlights. But is it possible to have too much of a good thing? Sagas do add some complexity to a set. That's why we never see them printed at common. But what if we could trade that complexity for another mechanic that appears in every set? We've already seen that sagas were inspired by an old Planeswalker design, and there are seemingly no shortage of new Planeswalker cards coming out every set. What if we could give Planeswalkers a little break and, in their place, print more sagas? They're certainly more fun, especially in Limited, where an unanswered Planeswalker effectively just reads, "You win the game." And they offer more variety rather than the 17th Chandra card. Maybe I would feel differently if sagas had been invented back in Lorwyn. Maybe I'd be sick of them by now. But I believe that, compared to sagas, Planeswalkers appear clunky and samey. Not to mention that, on the whole, they just make the game less fun, for me anyway. Nobody knows exactly what the future holds, but I, for one, would love to see a reduction in the number of Planeswalkers in favor of an increase in the number of sagas. But what do you think? Do you want to see more sagas in the future, or has that story been told? Let me know in the comments below, or perhaps just say what you feel is one of the best mechanics in Magic and why. It's a story that unfolds with every new set. And if you'd like to be there with us, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you can join in our tale.